Shechem, and so we were looking at one of these stones that would have looked like this, but it's only about a third of the way preserved.
Right.
Okay, so that stone, sometimes translated sacred stone, sometimes translated pillar, would have been this big, sit out in front of that temple. The stone that was the witness set up by Joshua to witness the renewal of the covenant. And then come over and look at this. What do you think this is?
An altar? The sacrifice?
Besides a mosquito manufacturing plant.
Man, looks like an altar.
Yeah, it's an altar. What do you think the basin that's holding the water right now is for?
Blood.
Blood, yes.
Blood.
Okay, so come on in and let's talk about this. Now, when you're studying an archaeological site, there's two things that you need to consider. First of all, what it looks like today, right? So we're standing here looking at it. That gives us perspective, but there's something very important archaeologically missing. And that is everything that was found during the excavation of this. You really don't understand this place unless you know what was found here. So let's go through what was found here. Here's one thing that was found here. Remember the snake idols that we saw in the Israel Museum?
Yeah.
Some of them were found here. This is representative of Moloch, the king of the Canaanite gods, is represented by a serpent. Remind you of anyone?
Yeah.
The other thing that was found here by the hundreds were these Asherah figurines of the woman holding her breasts. Remember, we saw lots of those in the museum as well.
Yeah.
Found here by the hundreds, a snake and a woman. Remind you of any story? Okay, now I'm going to walk this around and show you. This is from the one who excavated here in the late 1800s. His name is Macalister. Okay, and this is his drawing of what this place looked like. And look at the top line there, which is the you're good. You want to see these drawings.
Okay.
Stephen doesn't because he's already seen them all. Okay.
Oh wow.
So that's the soil line that you see going across the top of these stones.
Wow.
In other words, they were standing and a few of them were poking through. That's how he knew where to dig. And we're up on the top of the site. Okay. Now, underneath is a cave. Okay. And then I want you to look where my finger is pointing. What does it say there?
Stone with infant bones.
Say it loud.
Stone with infant bones.
Oh, man.
Okay, so I'm going to point to it. Underneath these standing stones, he excavated a cave. In the middle of the cave, an altar. And on the altar, the skeleton of a human infant. Which means they were sacrificing that child on the day that the place was destroyed. Which makes sense because that's what you do in ancient times to call upon your gods to save you. Okay? Now also there's these jar burials. He's got one of them drawn in here. You see this jar?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so question is what's in the jar? Before we get to the jars, here's another thing that was found here. This is the skeleton of a girl sawn asunder. A young girl who was cut in half. and buried next to these standing stones.
Is this your book too?
Yeah.
So is this to Moloch?
We're going to interpret it reading scripture here in a moment, but first of all, I just got to show you what was found here.
Buns.
Okay? Next, I'm going to show you what's in the jar. This is the inside of a jar, and you see a human infant in there that has been burned. This is all from Macalister's excavation report.
Did he know he was going to find this?
Yeah, basically. Because we'll interpret this using the Bible here in a minute. So do you see the infant? This is the infant. Burned.
It barely fits in the jar.
Well, if you didn't know, it would be shocking to come across.
There's the legs. Okay, now this is a picture of a child sacrifice. I have personally excavated a child sacrifice at a site 12 miles north of Jerusalem. This isn't the one that I did. This is in the Jordan Museum, actually. Okay. Now, this is Macalister's top plan. Okay, so he's drawing a plan of the site and what he found. Everywhere that he's got a J, big J, is a jar burial infant. A burned jar burial. Okay, so I'm going to show them to you. This line that you see right here, that's the standing stones that you see. You see them all? J, 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 J. They're all over this site. You see that?
They're all over here.
We're not talking one or two.
This is a cemetery.
Look, here's the standing stones.
Goodness.
Here's the altar right here that we're standing at. J, 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 J.
So would they bury those jars, or were they just sitting around there?
They buried them around these stones. So all these are all burned
Cemetery,
infants.
grave markers, apparently.
I don't think they're great.
All
You want
all over the place. As well as pits. You see pits here that were filled with the skeletons of children. Okay, so that's biblical archaeology. The archaeology, you dig a site like this, you record what you find. So now we know what was found here. It's not just archaeology, it's biblical archaeology. Now we do what Macalister did, and we go to the Bible to learn what this is. First of all, I'm going to read to you Genesis 15:16. This is at the time of Abraham. We were at Shechem, the first place that God appeared to Abraham in the land at Shechem. We are also at Mamre. This is what God says to him. In the 4th generation, Abraham, your descendants will come back here to this land. He's talking about what's going to happen when they go down to Egypt. For the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Okay, in the excavation report, what he calls this place is the sin of the Amorites. I should emphasize, this is just one site. They find these burned babies in jars in sites all over this country when you go back to this Canaanite period. Okay, so here's what this is. Let's interpret it with just this one verse out of Deuteronomy 12:31. What is the sin of the Amorites? God says this: you must not worship Yahweh, your God, in their way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things Yahweh hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their God, to their gods. Okay, so they're taking children. This is what's called a fertility cult. Now, it's not appropriate for me to go into the practices that they practiced at a fertility cult. Okay? Paul says don't even discuss it. So I'm not going to go into any detail, but I know that you know what I'm talking about when I say that the belief is that the fertility of the gods and the goddesses is connected to the fertility of humans, which is connected to the fertility of the land and the animals. So that's when you're reading your Bible and you're reading about prostitutes, both male and female, they're functioning at a place like this. And in addition to that, the sacrifice of children. It's kind of like a tithe. We're going to give our firstborn child, and then you're going to bless us and give us more children. We think. We don't know exactly because we don't have it detailed. This practice continued all the way into the Phoenicians are Canaanites, and they're the ones who established Carthage. This practice continued there all the way into the Roman period, and so we have detailed descriptions of how they sacrificed their children. And so they burned them with a statue that was over a fire, and they would place it in the arms of the statue. And as the face would melt, it would look like they were laughing. And they had this belief that they believed that they were enjoying being sacrificed. Okay, now here come the Israelites. They're over there on the east side of the Jordan, and they're getting ready to come in, right? And they're getting the law. These are Yahweh's people. They got to be obedient to Yahweh and his laws. He says this in Leviticus 18:21 to his people before they come into this land: do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Moloch, for you must not profane the name of God. Don't give any of your children to be sacrificed to this God. And Leviticus 22 is the penalty of disobeying that command. Say to the Israelites, any Israelite or any foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Moloch is to be put to death. And if you don't do it, God says he's going to do it. Now, understand that, at least for me, the number one argument that I hear against the Bible is that God is mean. Or that the God of the Old Testament is meaner than the God of the New Testament. No. What God is he's just.
That's right. Amen.
And if we don't understand his justness, then we don't understand who he is.
That's right.
And we don't understand our place. What would we think of a judge who let somebody go that sacrificed their children and killed them and burned them and put them in jars and buried them? We would not respect that judge, would we? Now here's a hard thing. Where's my bag? Here's a hard thing. Yeah, that's a good point. Will America or England or modern Israel, for that matter, be able to stand at the judgment and judge the Amorites?
No.
No. We'll be just as guilty.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, I'm going to go to Joshua. Okay. Joshua 10, verse 32. Yahweh handed Lachish over to Israel. Nope, that's not the right one. Let me see. 16.
Joshua 16.
16 verse 10. This is, it says this. They did not dislodge the Canaanites living in Gezer. So, of course, is Joshua's conquest. They did not dislodge the Canaanites who were doing this from Gezer. To this day, the Canaanites live among the people of Ephraim, but are required to do forced labor. Okay, now, this is a place to take in the understanding of the context of why God is telling his people, you got to wipe these people out.
Yeah, amen.
And you got to take this land.
Yeah.
Why? Because if you don't do it completely, then you're going to be led astray. And you're going to do the same detestable practices that they do. Did the conquest, was it complete?
Nope.
Nope. And this is a good example. And don't forget where this is. It's on the main road up from the coastal plain up to where? Does this practice ever go up this route up to Jerusalem?
I'm afraid so.
Absolutely. Remember we were reading about Ahaz sacrificing his son? Here's Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 55 years. He sacrificed his own son in the fire. Ahaz sacrificed his children in the fire in Ben Hinnom Valley, where we were standing down there in the horse manure, in that lowest place in Jerusalem. You got to take this and all that it is and all of its practice, and you got to move it up to Jerusalem itself. And there in the Ben Hinnom Valley, and who's doing it? Who's shedding the blood of the innocent? It says from one side of Jerusalem to the other, the kings from the house of David.
Oh, man.
Remember we stood in the palace where God promised David, I'm going to build you a house, David, through your offspring. And it's going to last forever. He had a son, Solomon, who became his heir. And what did Solomon do? He built the altars to these foreign gods on the hill across. Were they doing these practices on that hill over there? Absolutely they were. That's how you worship these gods.
Goodness.
God was angry. Should he have been angry?
Absolutely.
And he said to Solomon, for this, I'm going to divide the kingdom. I'm going to rip 10 tribes away from you. I'm going to do it in your son's reign, Rehoboam. We were at the place that it happened yesterday at Shechem. And so think of that. God promised his house, his eternal house, through his offspring, and then David's offspring take their offspring, the offspring of the covenant, the Davidic covenant of the promise, and sacrifice them to false gods. Was God just when he brought the Babylonians?
Yeah.
Didn't he say that the penalty for that was death?
Yes.
And destruction to Jerusalem, destruction to the temple that bore his name, the temple that was in David's heart to build, couldn't last. It was destroyed, because there's two things that when we read our Bibles never cease to amaze us, and when we look at the history and the archaeology of this land never cease to amaze us. One is the unfaithfulness of man, and the other one is the faithfulness of God.
Yeah.
That he didn't destroy his people completely, but he preserved a remnant to return from Babylon, the Babylonian exile, and rebuild Jerusalem. To preserve his people, because a place like this, if we don't take the time to look at the problem and to dwell in the problem that man is utterly and hopelessly evil. That's what archaeology is. Look, you just dig down through one layer after another, and what are you digging through? You're digging through the evidence for the problem of sin and death. You find it all over the place. That's why I want this to sink in, because in the next few days we're going to start looking at the archaeology of the good news. The good news of what God did for us, so that we don't get what we deserve, but we get his grace instead. But to understand that solution, we got to put into perspective how desperately we need it. Now here's the other thing.
How low can you go, man?
The other thing is this. In all these sites, they were finding these sacrificed babies. Okay. Kathleen Kenyon, for example, excavated several different child sacrifices in Jericho, Megiddo, Tanakh, Hatzor. So this is how it was interpreted by everybody. This is child sacrifice evidence up until the 1960s. Then it became politically incorrect to believe that the Canaanites sacrificed their children.
Well, the evidence is there.
Now you sit in archaeology class and you are taught there is no evidence at all for child sacrifice.
Good, nice.
And all the interpretations of old have been flipped over. This includes Carthage, where there is a cemetery where over 10,000 sacrificed children are buried, and we have Roman historians and Greek historians writing about it, and we have on the plaques of the sacrificed children depictions of priests sacrificing children. There is no archaeological evidence whatsoever for child sacrifice. Why? Because the secular viewpoint, you can have a bad apple here and there, right? That does evil, but you can't have a nation that is evil. And so all this stuff has been turned over, and I want to walk up now and look at the interpretation. If you're just out on a walk here and you come across this place and you go, wow, what the heck is this? Then you're going to go over to that sign right there to get the interpretation. So let's go look at the interpretation. We'll get to that. We'll get to that in the next thing we look at. You have some of the idols that were found down there, right? Here's a bull idol. Here's one of these female fertility goddess figurines. They're just giving you a few examples. So they have what they found down here, but look at what they say. Scholars believe the temple served as a venue where alliances between tribes or city-states were forged or renewed. The 10 monoliths may have symbolized the city of Gezer and 9 allied cities in its vicinity. Somebody walks up and looks at that and they go, oh, what the heck is that? That looks weird. Oh, these represent cities.
Interesting.
Are you kidding me? They have no clue of what the original excavator, and remember, you can only excavate a site like that one time. He buried it back up, and then another guy unburied it again and claims to have excavated it. No, all he did was unbury it again. Okay, so the basin may have served as a container for blood libation. At least they got that right. Poured during an alliance ceremony. A ritual of this type described in the Bible after Moses brought the 10 Commandments down Mount Sinai. Okay, and there are examples in the Bible. We saw one at Shechem yesterday of when they set a stone up. We're going to see another one tomorrow at Bethel where Jacob set a stone up. But they set a stone up for this reason and this reason only. They set it up as a witness to a covenant that was being made between them and God. Okay? They were not setting it up to worship, and they were not viewing it as God. That's what the Bible says these sacred stones are being done. So that's what you learn in archaeology class. You learn there's no, you're you learn a watered down version of the evil of man, and then of course the mythology of God, that there is a God. It raises man up and brings God down in his glory.
So Joel, would we
So,
say
so if you go and say to somebody, "Oh, we saw child sacrifice evidence," they would look at you like you're crazy. And who is teaching you? Whoever he is crazy. What was that, Marvin?
would you say then that these stones are a sign of a covenant between the Canaanites and their god Moloch or whatever?
Yes.
I believe.
Yeah, they would be. They would represent Moloch and other fertility goddesses and other gods. So this would be the main worship place for the city.